Hi everyone, welcome to this new episode of the Ukraine Conversations. My name is Eleonora Tafur-Ambrosetti. I'm a research fellow at the Russia, Caucasus and Central Asia Center here at ISPI. Today I have two very distinguished guests with me. First is Thomas Gomart, the director of the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI. He also founded and directed the IFRI's Russia Center. Among the many positions that he occupied, I'd like to stress that he was working for the French Ministry of Defense, and he's also been a fellow at the State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, in Moscow, which is a university affiliated with the Russian Foreign Ministry, and it's now at the center also of the controversy because of some supporting and some condemnation statements with regards to the war. Maybe we can also talk about that. Then we have Michael Kofman, who's the research program director in the Russia Studies program at CNA, and is also a fellow at the Kennan Institute, in the Wilson Center in DC. He's one of the most renowned military experts on Russia military forces. So I'd like to start with you, Michael, to ask for a general assessment on the situation on the ground, because sometimes it's very difficult also from the outside to see how is the special military operation evolving, what are the achievements and the problems that the Russian army faces, and also how are Russia's objectives changing throughout the conflict. Michael, over to you.
Sure. Well, let me try to be brief with that expansive question. The war began as a poorly conceived quick regime change operation, where a lot on the Russian military side was ill-conceived and not well organized. They since made adjustments, but in the military campaign, they pursued lots of different objectives, I think driven by their political goals. And in many ways, it was a diffuse effort where a lot of the Russian military campaign was almost competing with itself. The performance has been unimpressive. Nonetheless, they've made some gains. Where the war settled out now is into three main fronts. One around the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, where Russian forces are largely holding. I don't think there's going to be a battle for Kiev. There, the fight's going to probably seesaw, but it will eventually lead to more consolidated lines. The second one is very similar in the southwest, between Kherson and Mykolaiv on the southwestern coast of Ukraine. There too, the Russian effort ran out of steam. Ukrainian counterattacks have pushed Russian forces back to Kherson, and now it looks like Russian forces there are trying to fix or pin Ukrainian forces to hold them. And the main focus of Russian strategy is on taking the city of Mariupol and on the Donbass, where a large percentage of the Ukrainian military is deployed in what is called the Joint Forces Operation. There's a sizable percentage of their ground combat military power. Russian forces are trying to encircle the Ukrainian military in the Donbass. That's the one area where Ukraine's position might be somewhat precarious. In recent weeks, as expected, the Russian military had become exhausted and lost combat effectiveness. They've taken substantial casualties over the last couple of weeks. They've lost quite a bit of equipment. So their offensive potential was exhausted. They had to take a big operational pause. Now we're beginning to see a focus in the Russian military operation. We're also seeing Ukrainian counterattacks trying to incrementally take back some territory. In part, I think, because the opportunity is there in terms of momentum, but also because I'm sure Ukrainians know that if they don't, Russian forces are likely to dig in. So this week and maybe the next is their best opportunity to try to retake some territory before it becomes much harder. What the future holds, that's somewhat in question, right? They're signaling from the Russian side that they're creating options for themselves to end this war early, see how far they can get in the next couple of weeks, claim that the war was really about the Donbass in the first place, maybe trade back some of the territory they occupied in exchange for political settlement, or alternatively, maybe continue occupying those parts of Ukraine and even partition the country. Right now, it's hard to tell. I think they're trying to create a range of options, and they're trying to salvage something that they can from what so far has been a fairly unimpressive military operation.
Thank you. Very interesting. Well, we've seen the violence and the war going on, but also the resuming of the peace negotiations. And today in Istanbul, we saw another round of talks. So, Thomas, I would like to ask you, what could turn the tide and accelerate a sustainable diplomatic solution? Because Zelensky also opened to the possibility of declaring neutrality, Ukraine's neutrality, so abandoning the plans to join NATO, but this doesn't seem to be enough for Russia. So how do you see the peace negotiations evolving, and what role could possibly the EU play to accelerate a diplomatic solution?
First of all, Eleonora, thank you for your invitation. Very happy to have this discussion with Michael. To be honest, I don't see, a diplomatic solution coming very soon. Given what was described by Michael, I think that's on the military fronts. There are many things. That's a very fast-moving situation, and of course. Everyone would like to see a ceasefire, but to be honest, I don't see it appearing at the time being. That leads me to another observation, which is maybe a big difference in terms of approaches between Russia and the West, and maybe between Russia and the European countries. For Europeans, before 24th of February, there was this idea that diplomacy was a substitute to the use of force. And if you observe, the Russian way of operating, there is no substitution, but simultaneous diplomatic movement and military movements. And I think that in terms of positioning, the coercion made by Russia is to combine all the time the two approaches. That leads me also to the idea that, given the huge difficulties previously described by Michael, we can also anticipate maybe that, I don't know if a ceasefire, but every type of diplomatic maneuver could be a way for Russia to try to restore or to repair, if it's possible, its military tool. So I think we should make a confusion between a real and solid diplomatic settlements, which I don't see at the time being, once again, with possible what I could call strategic pause, especially on the Russian side, to once again to repair what can be a repair in terms of a military tool. In this context, what about what can be done by Europe? It's interesting to observe that there are different channels to try to precisely to be back on the diplomatic scene. Turkey is also very important. Israel played a role. There are also some contacts through India and certainly China. On the pure European side, what is striking at the time being, maybe that's two things. First, the level of transatlantic cooperation and unity to some extent. And in line with that, the magnitude of the sanctions taken by the West, and which will be much more detrimental for European countries than for the US.
Well, thank you so much. Another important actor in this context is certainly France. So maybe later we can also talk about its role. But before going on with the second round of questions, I'd like to remind the audience that they can send their own questions through our social media. So we will try to at least ask a few questions from the audience. But I'd like to go back to Michael. and to talk more about the military situation. Well, we have heard Zelensky's calls for imposing a no-fly zone, but this option seems to be ruled out. So I'd like to ask you, what are the other options that NATO has to help Ukraine, in addition to what it has been doing so far?
I mean, there aren't tremendous options. NATO's already helping Ukraine extensively with almost any kind of military support that makes sense. And one of the challenges, people always want to do more, but you have to balance the risk of escalation. You have to balance the risk of whether or not it makes sense to do certain things more. And there are a lot of questions still regarding organizing the military support that I think NATO's already agreed to send Ukraine. But I'm not in charge of NATO policy, nor am I in charge of advising it, so it's not really the best question for me. I think people that do make recommendations should always check in to find out what the United States and NATO are already doing, and then ask themselves whether or not they have any advice in addition to those propositions and those ideas already being executed.
But for instance, the United States has been giving extensive military aid to Ukraine, right? So far, it was over $2.5 billion, or am I wrong?
Well, that's over the past years, but I think most NATO countries have given Ukraine a lot of the advanced weapons they have in current stocks. Many actually are not going to have additional anti-tank guided missiles or other capabilities to give Ukraine, because they've basically given them most of everything they have to spare. They're actually going to have to go back and make more at this point, right? You still have large shipments from the UK, from the United States, and you now have NATO countries trying to take out of stock late generation Soviet air defenses that they have, offering those to Ukraine as well in exchange for hoping to get some replacements. Long story short, a lot of what is practical to offer Ukraine is now already being offered or in the process of being transferred.
I see. So I'd like to go back to Thomas with a $1 million question. It's very difficult at the moment to imagine a future of for EU-Russia relations, but still, Russia is our neighbor, and we must find a way to have a working relationship with Moscow. What future do you see for this relationship?
Well, maybe in line with the point just made by Michael about the stocks. You know, this crisis could also be read as the consequences of an historical process, which is as follows. Europeans started their disarmament 2 generations ago. At the beginning of the 70s, you know, for Europeans, the level of military spending was between 3 and 4% of GDP. Now we are between 1.5 and 2% of GDP. So European disarmed since 2 generations, when other strategic players such as the US, China, but also Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, started their rearmament 1 generation ago. And that's explained a lot of the difficulties for Europeans just to have strategic credibility. And the point on stocks is very important, because I do think that to some extent European countries, most of them already gave almost everything that could give in the current circumstances, which is very challenging and which creates a particular role for the US regarding Ukraine at the time being. So in these circumstances, if you ask to Russian colleagues at the time being what they do expect from the relation with the EU, the I would say most widespread answer in the strategic community is to say nothing. Because I do think that that's only through a discussion with the US and China that maybe a solution could be achieved. And all the moods, you know, about the relation between the EU and Russia seems to me, unfortunately, very far away. If you remember that in the past, before 2014, we had every 6 months EU-Russia summits. Given the importance of the economic relation between Russia and the EU, I think it's a completely new world. In particular, if the EU is able to really transform its energy links with Russia. But the magnitude of this fast-moving change is something, in my opinion, at the timing, which is not at all properly anticipated by European governments. So, as you can imagine, I'm not very optimistic for this relation between Europe and Russia for the next generation. And you have some Russian colleagues who openly consider that it's the next generation is a lost generation. For when I speak about generation, it's at least 20 years for the relation between Europe and Russia.
I see. And also a particular aspect related to that is also how long the EU members will keep presenting this united front once the consequences of sanctions, the economic consequences of sanctions will be felt very harsh, especially on some countries. Italy is more vulnerable, let's say, to Russia's blackmail when it comes to energy compared to France, for instance. I'd like to go back to Michael with a question regarding another long-standing conflict in the post-Soviet region. Recently, Moscow has accused Azerbaijani forces of violating the peace deal in Nagorno-Karabakh and entering the peacekeeping zone. So do you see any relationship between what's happening in Ukraine and these accusations of Azerbaijan escalating violence again in the Nagorno-Karabakh?
I'd be surprised that this is a coincidence. Russian leaders have accused Azerbaijan of essentially violating the ceasefire agreement by entering the Russian peacekeeping mission zone in the part of Nagorno-Karabakh Russian forces are deployed. To me, it looks like a probe by Azerbaijan. They understand that most Russian forces are occupied in Ukraine, that Russia has had to pull units away from even bases like those in Armenia and Ossetia and Abkhazia and Tajikistan as well. So they understand that now the Russian military is off in a bad way, and they need to pull on as many forces they have deployed elsewhere. So I think they're sensing an opportunity to gain more territory or to achieve some sort of fait accompli in order to move the actual line of control in Nagorno-Karabakh, and clearly Russia's pushing back hard on that. I don't know what the situation is right now, to be honest. I'm pretty tied up with the Russia-Ukraine war, and you can only stare at one major war at any given time at the end of the day. So maybe somebody else who's an expert sitting in the area has a better day-to-day perception of what's happening in that conflict.
Thank you. There is a question for you, Michael, by Federico, who's asking if could Ukrainian units deployed in Donbass withdraw in good order in case of a double-pronged attack?
I don't know, can they? I mean, that's kind of the question, isn't it? War is highly contingent, and the answer is it depends. I think there's good news and bad news on that front. The good news is that it's quite a substantial distance from main Russian logistical sustainment points to complete a double envelopment of Ukrainian forces in Donbass. And there aren't a lot of Russian forces available, from what I can tell, in the northern part of that advance. All right. The bad news is that they are steadily gaining territory, and it's not clear what the rate of attrition is for Ukrainian forces. We don't really know what the state of Ukrainian forces is. Right? A lot of what we get are glimpses of the equipment losses the Russian military has had, and we have estimates that range widely about the casualties the Russian military has had. But let me ask you, what do you know about the state of Ukrainian forces in this war? The answer is probably, honestly, close to nothing. And we have to be frank about that. So there's a great deal of uncertainty. As an analyst, I'm comfortable with the discomfort of uncertainty. So the honest answer is we don't know.
Well, yes, I share your approach. So let's go back to Thomas with the question that I anticipated earlier on the role of France. We've seen a quite active role, especially of the French President Macron. So I'd like to ask more about the relationship between France and Russia, and especially in light of the upcoming elections in France. How do you see this relationship evolving?
Well, three things on that. First of all, an historical reminder. You know, there is sometimes, especially in Europe, an exaggeration of this relation between France and Russia during the Cold War, between France and the USSR. I think it's important to remind that the driving force, you know, of French security policy since the beginning of the Fifth Republic, it is first of all the P3. So this very narrow relations between Paris, Washington, and London, due to the nuclear things. And by the way, in terms of wish not to escalate on the nuclear side, it was rather than within the P3 than within NATO for this crisis. The second driving force, it is what is very important, of course, is the relation between France and Germany, with many things to be said. And since you know the beginning of the Fifth Republic, you had this idea that USSR, Russia are inevitable in terms of European security, which is absolutely obvious, and that there is a need to have a discussion with Moscow, even if these discussions are very difficult to be implemented. So I start with that because this process can be observed for every French president. And on that, President Macron is not at all original, but in pure continuation with the previous ones. So what he did, it is first of all, after having welcomed Angela Merkel, Donald Trump, he welcomed in 2017, just after his election, President Putin in Versailles at Trianon. And it was very ambivalent because at the same time there is this invitation, which is, as I said, in line with the historical heritage, plus also very tough discussion about, you know, the Russian ingerence in the French electoral process in 2017, the role of Russian media and so on. But there was these channels, which, in my opinion, once again, are the continuation of old things, if I could say. The second important date was 2019 with the Brégançon meeting, when President Macron tried to re-engage once again President Putin, especially regarding the situation in Syria. It was very, very quickly deadlocked because of different things. I have no time to elaborate. But the idea in Paris is to keep these channels, because even if there is war at the timing, there is no doubt at all, you know, in Paris about what is done by Russia, the resistance of Ukraine, the links also between l'Élysée and Zelensky. The idea is still to say that whatever the termination of this war will be, Russia will continue to be in Europe. The same for Ukraine. So to some extent, channel should be kept open, even if the Russian aggression of Ukraine is so brutal. Now for the elections, you're right, that's an interesting point, because there are a few candidates who supported openly to some extent Putin during the last few years for different reasons. And for them, it's very challenging now to justify their past support. And in my opinion, they lost a lot of credibility in terms of their ability to drive, if they were elected, to drive foreign policy.
Well, same as Salvini here in Italy, the populist politician who praised Putin a lot of times in public, and now is kind of in a difficult position because of his past positions. Michael, there is another question from Federico for you. Again, Federico likes you quite a lot. So he wants to know whether there are any news about the difficulty or not to supply Ukrainian units, except, of course, for Mariupol.
That's a good question. You know, one of the remarkable things about this conflict is that I think people expected the Russian military to blockade Ukrainian cities and to try to isolate sectors early on. They've not really gone after a lot of that critical infrastructure, like railways, for example, until maybe the last week in this war. What they have gone after were supplies like ammunition, fuel, oil, and critical infrastructure. So they have been, you know, to use a bad boxing analogy, steadily working the body. That's the sustainment behind Ukraine's military effort. But Ukraine is still able to resupply units, even in frontline cities like Kharkiv. And it is able to get supplies from the West, is able to get weapons from the West. Part of the challenge the Russian military has is they actually can't interdict the flow of a lot of these supplies in Western Ukraine. Why? Because first, they don't have a ground presence, and they barely have enough forces for what they're trying to do now, right? Second, in order to interdict them, they would need to use either rotary aviation, combat helicopters, or tactical aviation, fixed wing. But again, that would be very challenging because how are they going to target the flow of supplies? And they're going to lose a lot of aircraft to air defense. So they've chosen actually to reduce their losses and not attempt to do it in this way, since they don't have air superiority in those parts of Ukraine. And even trying to blockade other major cities like Kiev, they've had major issues. They never completed encirclement of Kiev. They never even really got halfway there. So you can see that supplies are actually flowing to most areas and most cities in Ukraine. I think probably the issue Ukraine is going to have is if they choose to sustain counteroffensives, right? That's where they're going to have challenges. The logistical side of the equation is much easier for the defending side. That is not the side trying to project power across terrain, and it's not the side trying to walk further away from the logistics. If Ukrainians intend to sustain counteroffensives, they're not going to have issues. And we have some indicators, at least good circumstantial evidence, that they too have suffered non-insignificant amount of loss in terms of equipment, right? So these could become issues.
Thank you very much. We have just 1 minute, and I'd like to ask the last question to Thomas. It is about the state of Russia's civil society. We've seen, a big movement of opposition against the war, but we've seen also the scale of the Kremlin's repression. So my question is, in light of what we have discussed about the general state of EU-Russia relations, could Brussels do anything to reach out to those Russians who oppose Putin and are facing increasing difficulties in Russia? Could we do anything to reach out to them?
Well, there are three things. The very first one is, there is the huge number of refugees from Ukraine. This magnitude is very, very impressive. There is also, I think, a wave of Russian immigrants to some extent. So my first point will be on that. just to be able to welcome these different waves, it's a very big challenge for the EU. Second, personally, I was not surprised by the invasion, but I was really surprised by the magnitude and the level of military losses. And I didn't interpret, the losses given by the Russian Ministry of Defense as an attempt to be transparent, but much more as a way to accelerate the militarization of the Russian society. And that leads me to the final point. I'm afraid of the things of sort of radicalization. I can observe, in my contacts with some Russian colleagues at the time being, and for instance, on a very particular specific point, which is the sanctions, the fact that the magnitude of the sanction was not explained by also the possibility of a reversibility of these sanctions. Leads to a situation in which many Russian colleagues do say that what is the justification to stop war if we know that this sanction will continue for many years to some extent. So on that, certainly there is a need for Europeans to adjust, I would say, the political discourse on sanctions.
Very interesting, especially the last point. I also have discussed about this very topic with my Russian colleagues, and they were basically saying the same thing. I mean, there is no conditionality in these sanctions. That there is no light, let's say, in the tunnel. So it's very depressing indeed. Well, our time has come to an end. So I'd like to thank both Michael Kofman and Thomas Gomart for sharing their insights with us. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you here. And I hope I can welcome you again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.